And also they raised a number of issues that we need to address, but some specifically will be addressed by Minister of Water and Environment. We shall bring the issues. We are supposed to meet the Minister of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries because they host the UNCCD. Issues to do with climate change and land use is really a very serious issue, and they're the ones, so we have rescheduled them. We had wanted to meet all the other partners before Minister of Water and Environment, but Minister of Agriculture was not ready. So today we are meeting Minister of Water and Environment, Change Department, and this is your bill. And so the question is, are we now ready to present this bill on the floor of Parliament, because it has stayed for some time, since 30th June when the minister tabled it. So we really need to work on that bill so that it is passed. But now we need to address all the concerns raised so that we don't get obstacles when we finally table it for second reading. But I would ask the clerk to, before you even present, to give us the highlights of the concerns from the other partners which should be addressed by Minister of Water and Environment, so that they can be addressed before your presentation. Okay, the clerk is saying maybe some of the questions could be answered during your presentation. But one thing which I remember is they say, why are we putting force of law, that this bill is giving force of law in Uganda to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, when Paris Agreement replaced Kyoto Protocol. So that was one concern Ministry of Energy raised. But the rest, we are going to, let's listen to the presentation and then they can be clarified. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome you, but the most important thing now is to see whether we are ready to tell the clerk to put it on order paper so that it goes for second reading. Thank you very much. And now I would like to request you to do your presentation, Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Honorable Chair and Honorable members of the committee. I'm called Beatrice Anywar, the State Minister for Water and Environment, and a personally interested party to the bill. But I want to make it on record that this bill is our bill.
Yes.
Not only the ministry. I think this committee, this is the first child we are going to give out, both of us.
Yes.
It's a new committee and there's a new bill. So this is our bill. We have been looking at it all through. Mr. Chairman and honorable members, I want to congratulate you for the recently concluded elections. Many have gone through, many have not gone through, but there's life after Parliament. We still have to support each other in different fields and make the country move on. Mr. Chairman, I came with my team is here. I think he will introduce himself as he makes the next presentation. I'm very grateful for the work of the committee, because since the bill was tabled, I'm aware you have been having a lot of consultations and meetings. As a ministry, we appreciate all your time. Others were already hiding from COVID, but you ventured to see this go. And the question of whether we are ready to present it or not, I think this is a combined effort. We should make sure that the child is born. So how we combine our efforts, which majorly is based on your work you have done as a committee, we as the ministry would be very happy to see that this bill is tabled probably before the current session of the parliament, so that the new team doesn't start from again zero. If you can do this the earliest, the better. And we believe that the technical team we have are competent enough to fill in the gaps as fast as possible, and we moved forward. The objectives of the bills are clear to, I think, most of us. I've personally gone through the whole bill about twice or three times, and I'm just looking at what are the gaps that needs to be filled in, and we move. And as you have said, you are also giving us what are the feeders from other stakeholders, because it is our bill for all of us. So because of the time, I will not bother the committee again through the objectives. We must be guided by the objective of the bill. It should really be at the center of it to move us forward. So as the time will not be our best ally, and assuming that really members have gone through this, I would want to request my technical person, Bob, to run us through this write-up, and meanwhile I will concentrate on the questions that will arise thereafter. So Bob, come on board and run the committee through this.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Honourable Chair and honourable members. Well, we're very pleased to present. I think this is the third or fourth time that we are interfacing on this, and I think, like you rightly said, on our part, Honourable, we are ready, and I hope the conversation that I'm going to take you through actually points to that direction. So how am I summarizing my story? If you look at the outline, I want to talk about the background, international context, and the national policy context. And there are so many reasons to that. I'll come to that, because there is where we're starting from, so that it gives us a bit of direction of where we are going, talking about the UNFCCC, and I think it relates so much with the question Honorable Song has raised about the Kyoto Protocol. Then I'll also emphasize a bit on the Kyoto Protocol, and when I get there I'll try to answer that question. And then talk through about the new emerging issues in the climate policy regime, which is the Paris Agreement, or the NDCs, which is as recent as 2015. So I'll also talk about the post-2015 climate regime, which actually bestows on us new reporting obligations. Then I run you through the functions of the department as it is in the climate change policy, the challenges we envisage, and then the provisions that have been provided for with the justification, and then run into the conclusion. But if you look at the outline, the first four actually clearly show you why we must or we need to have this bill. So in terms of provisions and justification, I'll also try to give my insights onto that. But I'm also happy to note that I came along with a lawyer who was part of the drafting team, Mr. Bernard Namanya, who is right behind there, and will be useful to hear all the views that are coming through. I had also extended the invitation to First Parliamentary Council, but they are caught up. But regardless, every issue that comes through out of here, we should be able to put our heads around it and come back to you. So what is my key take home? Because I may say lots of things and then we don't point to one or two things. So my key take home for this presentation are three issues. The first thing is that as a country we've done fairly well on the policy front. So enactment of this legislation actually signals long-term commitment to policy implementation. That is one. The second thing is, as you realize from the slides I'm going to present, is that climate change policy landscape, as you'll see, is so dynamic and constantly changing, which ultimately actually requires us to have some kind of framework law that we think is going to set forth rules, rights, and obligations of government, the business entities, and the different citizens altogether. So that's, for me, how I'm summing up my talk. So in terms of background, for us in the climate change space, I think you need to have an idea about what the convention speaks to. That's where the journey starts. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in 1992, which provides some kind of general framework for action for the different parties that have signed and ratified to. Then we have the Kyoto Protocol, which was so much binding on the developed countries, because talking about climate change is largely about emission reductions for the start. So this was actually looking at how developed countries can reduce emissions based on the periods that are covered in there, but also the second objective, to ensure that they support developing countries, because if you talk about historical responsibility, this is where historical responsibility comes in. The Bali Action Plan is when the discussions initially of limiting temperature below 2 degrees started. So you can imagine, Bali, I think, happened 10 or 15 years ago from here, and the 2-degree temperature rise or below was only concluded in Paris in 2015. So you can see how long and how spread these discussions are. I think it points to how complex they are. So the newest document that we have in the climate policy regime is the Paris Agreement, which correspondingly goes hand in hand with nationally determined contributions that I'll explain in one of the slides. So in terms of the convention, the key question that you'll be asking me, I suppose, is that what does the convention strive to do? The convention, just like any other document that there is about climate change, is striving to see that they avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change from happening. And by anthropogenic, it means that people are responsible for putting out these emissions in the atmosphere. And it's the same people, again, that should be able to respond and address the emission profiles as they come in. And that particular framework also has principles and commitments. But the very first principle is that it puts emphasis on the developed countries to take lead on the because of the historical responsibility, that developed countries must take lead in addressing and combating climate change, while developing countries can do that based on their common but differentiated responsibility. Article 4 talks about commitments, what we should do. And again, this will be emphasized in the new reporting obligations that there are. They talk about parties taking into account our differentiated responsibilities based on the historical responsibility. And you're supposed, for example, to develop and periodically update, publish, and make available to the Conference of Parties in accordance with Article 12, what they call the national inventory, the greenhouse gas inventory. And in this same spirit, preparing a national inventory is about 3 ways. One, you collect data and information, you analyze the data, and then you produce the reports which you're supposed to submit to the UNFCCC. It's not so much about submitting to UNFCCC, but I think it also clearly shows the emission profiles in country, which is a good thing, and also gives us a basis upon which different sectors must act. When you come to the Kyoto Protocol, as I said, there are 2 broad objectives. The first objective, which has been clearly met, is by developing countries working within themselves to try and reduce emissions below the 1990 levels as they were set. But what has not been met under the Kyoto Protocol, and that's why it needs to continue, is helping non-annexed big countries like Uganda, to reduce emissions. So that relates to your question that you put across, Honorable. So what does that mean? That means strengthening probably international cooperation and see how we can work with Annex 1 countries to support us in our endeavors, adaptation, mitigation, so that we're also able to contribute to emission reductions. Then we have the Paris Agreement, which Paris Agreement merely reinforces the implementation of the convention. And that's why I said you can't talk about the Paris Agreement without necessarily referring back to where we're coming from, the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. The only difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol is that it creates this bifurcated model. Because remember, initially it was developed versus developing. What the Paris Agreement and NDCs talk about is that how can we, whether developed or developing, come together in the spirit of collective responsibility to put across what we can do. And that's why we have things like the nationally determined contribution. Nationally determined meaning you assess the capacities within which you have and then put forward any actions that you think you can undertake, of course with the support bearing in mind Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC, you put that as a commitment that you want to achieve to contribute to emission reductions. So in this, as a country, based on our common but differentiated responsibility and the capacities that we have crafted the NDCs. But before that, the Paris Agreement, at the heart of the Paris Agreement, we have, for example, the mitigation target. Keeping temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade while maintaining 1.5 on the table. I'm saying this because it's going to reflect so much in the obligations and the responsibilities that we have that need to be factored into this bill. Keeping temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade, but also maintaining 1.5 on the table. The concept of balancing emissions and sources to net zero towards the end of the century. So that means you have to come up with strategies that point to that direction of reducing emissions to net zero. Of course, there was a lot of discussion about adaptation, loss and damage, and so on and so forth. And most importantly, the discussion about effectively making financial flows. And I'm sure all members here, especially Honorable Songa, knows what happened to the 100 billion that was promised a couple of years ago. So whether that is realized or not is one thing, but at least at global level, there is this pronouncement to ensure that money is provided and countries can access it to implement the strategies that they've put forward. So in terms of NDC, as I said, we looked inward as a country and tried to give a direction of the kind of things that we can do based on our circumstances. And in that NDC, we zeroed so much into nature-based solutions. Because if you talk about emission reductions, we already have quick wins in nature-based solutions. It's talking about increasing forest cover from about 10.9 as it was in 2012 to about 12% by 2030. Same applies to wetlands but also talking about promoting renewable energy. So those, in a summary, encompasses the targets that we put forward in the NDC that we submitted in 2015.
I think, Mr. Chairman, just guide your members to know where the presentation is going on so that we move together.
Okay.
Members should not be left behind.
1,001 apologies. Thank you so much, Honorable.
Okay.
Yes,
So now we are going to the post-2015 reporting obligations, which come out of the Paris Agreement that we have signed. So what does what we have signed and ratified imply on us. It implies, for example, that we have to be a part where you see those circles and diagrams that show the trajectory between 2018 and 2050.
Yeah.
That at the signing of the Paris Agreement, for example, we had submitted the INDC, which becomes the NDC. But in between that, because there are rules that are supposed to be adopted in order to start actually effectively talking about the NDCs, and that we adopted what they call the Paris Rulebook, except the rulebook still has a bit of controversial elements under Article 6, which is markets and non-markets, but it's largely was supposed to be completed by 2018. Now looking at 2020, if you look at the previous slide that had the targets, there's what I forgot to emphasize, that these submissions that we are making from 2015, we are supposed to make submission every after 5 years. So for example, we submitted an NDC in 2015 that had those targets that I have mentioned. We are now in 2020, as it is that was agreed, we are supposed to communicate a new or updated NDC and the long-term strategies, which I can confidently say that the ministry is undertaking, and we should be able to submit this before June, because the UNFCCC does a synthesis report around May, June, and all countries are expected to do that. Of course, the question would be, here we have 2020 and Uganda hasn't finalized its NDC. The answer is very simple, that it's not only Uganda, it's actually most countries that have not done it. It was due to the COVID pandemic that came, and everything came to a standstill. And by extension, there is that natural rule that we extend, but ideally we're supposed to submit before the subsequent COP, which will be in Glasgow. So once we submit the new updated NDC, then there's what we call the global stock take. All countries go and present the targets that they have put forward. And as I said in my second slide about the national inventory, you can present the national inventory and it is critiqued by all the other different parties for you to justify the kind of numbers that you've come up with that point to the targets that you've set forth. 2025 then means you also have to come up with a new NDC. There's a difference here between 2020 and 2025 because our initial NDC goes up to 2030. There are countries that have NDCs that run up to 2025. Now for those ones that have NDCs that run up to 2025, they ideally are supposed to communicate new ones. But for us, what we are doing is merely updating and enhancing the already, because of the timelines that there is. But by 2025, as you can see, there's only one option: communicate new or updated NDC. And by 2025, we have to communicate a new one because ours then will be coming to finish by 2030. Again, the routine is the same. You undergo a global stock take after 3 years, and then 2030 we develop a new one. And all this is envisaged, for example, to ensure that we move towards net zero towards the mid half of the century. These are particular decisions, and I think I've made reference to them, that each party shall communicate an NDC every after 5 years. The kicker here is that each successive NDC has to represent a progression beyond the party's current target that we've put. What that means is that if we have pledged to reduce emissions by 10% by 2030, the subsequent one has to be a +1 or so, but not so much not so much less about the previous target that we set ourselves to achieve. There are also other new reporting obligations. We normally submit what we call a biannual update report, which biannual update report actually looks at emission profiles every after 2 years. But with a new enhanced transparency framework, we'll come to an end of these biannual update reports, and we'll submit what we call the biannual transparency reports. after 2024. So how do we generate these reports? And this again is important to show how we work alongside all the different entities. There are two options, but I think the option that we're emphasizing on is the one on this, on the left, far left, where you see a central inventory agency. This is where we are, where we have these diagrams that show the data that we collect and from who and how we use it. So we collect data from all the different ministries and agencies. We also collect data from all private entities and businesses, and of course academia. So we use that into the central inventory that helps us develop these national inventory reports that we submit to the UNFCCC. As I said earlier, these reports only help us to identify the emission profiles across the different sectors. So, next is the functions, a bit of it, but I think from what I've explained, it can clearly point to what kind of functions that we do. One of them is meet Uganda's international obligations, because as I said, there are all those reports that we must do. It's not just so much about the reports doing them, but I think it also clearly shows the kind of commitment that we have into addressing climate change impacts. And so there's also a function of providing policy and strategic guidance on climate change. We develop various climate change policies. You could have heard of the National Climate Change Policy 2015, but also the costed implementation plan. If we have this bill, for example, it may help us into going into actual implementation of this bill, because there's some information that we require, but you can't get it from the different entities. Supporting research, communication, and outreach on climate change, just to ensure that, because we know communication and outreach trickles action, and concerted effort of that will actually trickle more action across the different individuals and entities. Integration of climate change is key. We've tried to do this in a bit of haphazard manner, looking at, for example, education. But we only do this because of the external support that we get. For example, for integration of climate change in the education curriculum for primary, we got a bit of support from the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, UNITA, which supported us to do that. Operationalize market mechanisms. Now, market mechanisms is the value that we create in conserving the environment and storing these emissions. That if you have stored the emissions in the place X, then you kind of look through the different trading systems that there are to trade that air that you have saved and calculated and computed. Although there is a kicker to this, that the rules are not yet so fully finalized under Article 6, but as it is, we are still just trying to compile the benefits that there are in terms of emission reductions that we accrue out of implementing different projects. Monitoring and implementation of the climate change policy, but also support on mobilization of climate finance. How do we do this? We support other sectors in coming up with bankable projects and proposals that we submit to the international funding windows that exist. Challenges, implementation still remains a challenge because the measures versus the policies that there are. The national climate change policy, for example, estimated the policy of implementation versus coordination. If I recall very well, the policy alone points to requiring about $3.4 billion US. That's about $150 million every year to implement that policy. Getting that money is an arm and leg. The legal framework, which you're trying to do now, because we require information from the various sectors, but also interest of all the stakeholders if we are to collectively address.
Sorry, Chair, I beg your pardon on the estimated cost that we require.
According to the Climate Change Policy 2015, it points to Uganda requiring about $3.4 billion. Now that translates to about $253 million every year, if you're to implement that policy as is. Because we did the policy measures and we also did the cost implication, the costed plan, and all those documents are available. In terms of information sharing, as I said, it's not so easy to share information among ourselves, but I think if we have this kind of instrument that actually compels entities to provide information, then it's something that is going to help us moving forward. Finance flows internally versus external drive. We have been so overly reliant on the external financing, which, as the Honorable Minister will tell you, it may not be so very predictable and reliable. So then we have to begin thinking inward. Dedicated research, which is actually a prerequisite for any policy direction that you want to take. So, we now go into the provisions as they are in the bill and the justification. For the start, honorable members, the bill consists of 7 parts and 29 sections. Part 1 is broadly just the preliminary part that provides for the commencement of the Act, interpretation, the application of the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. Section 1, the justification is very clear that this provides that the Act shall come into force on a date to be appointed by the Minister by a statutory instrument. But we also think that the effect of this section is just about that the Act will not come automatically into force upon being assented to by the President. And there are so many advantages to that. That in terms of preparedness, we may not have everything in place at the time the bill is assented to. And it gives the ministry time to put the house in order to ensure that once we effectively begin implementing this, everything else is in order. Section 2 is interpretation, and this merely provides the definitions of the selected words, which is common language in the climate change regime, but there are so many phrases that come through that may be new to people. Section 3 is the purpose of the Act, and the section summarizes the main underlying issues the Act is intended to address. Section 4, Convention and its protocol and the agreement to have force of law in Uganda. What we are looking at here is that we have signed and ratified many of those conventions and protocols. So here we're trying to see how this proposed legislation will enable international climate change treaties, to which we are a party to have the force of law in Uganda. And I think there's been a precedent set, for the lawyers who know it better than myself, is that there's been a precedent set by the first Parliamentary Council, and the examples are there. For example, the Diplomatic Privileges Act, CAP 201, which domesticates the Vienna Convention. Part 2, Honourable Minister, Honourable Chair, Honourable Members, is summarizes the national climate change responses, measures and action, which actually looks at a framework strategy on climate change and other national climate change action plans to be undertaken by at the center, local government, but also the powers and duties of the lead agencies. Part 3 is about climate change mechanisms, which I talked about, including carbon markets, which provides for participation in climate change mechanisms, in monitoring of compliance in climate change mechanisms. Part 4 is about the measuring, reporting and verification. So what is the detail of this part 2? In terms of climate change response, section 5, the framework strategy on climate change. We think that the strategy on climate change is important because it's going to guide government in planning, budgeting, financing, and monitoring of climate change programs in country. That points to effectiveness. Section 6 of Part 2 is the National Climate Change Action Plan, where the department is tasked to come up with a National Climate Change Action Plan which provides specific climate change measures and actions for all the different sectors based on which they'll be implementing these actions. Section 7, we recognize there's lots of action that goes through at the district local government, and we think that undertaking a district climate change action plan that will enable specific climate change actions to be implemented at the different districts is quite important, because the vulnerability of Zombo is different from the vulnerability of Bududa, for example. So once the districts have this and they use this to include in their 5-year development plans, it will be helping us move 2 steps forward as opposed to moving 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. Section 8 is participation in climate change mechanisms. This section provides for participation in a number of market mechanisms. This is seemingly a good opportunity if the legal regime kind of addresses it, because it's aimed at contributing to mitigation of greenhouse gases and supporting sustainable development as elaborated in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. But how does Article 6 work, for example? Article 6 works, for example, by allowing a country which is technologically advanced like the Netherlands to come and do a project in Uganda. Probably it could be, it could build a wind farm. Now, out of building the wind farm, we can come up and we can understand the emission reductions that accrue to that project that has been undertaken. The only dilemma is that the emission reductions that are accrued from Netherlands building that wind farm is that they want to take those emission reductions to account for their emission reductions. So conversely, Uganda then will have to do what we call a corresponding adjustment, that those will not count on our part, but will count on the part of Netherlands. Whether that is a good or bad thing, I think it's subject to debate. But what we are thinking about is that whilst we are so much talking about improving individual livelihood and well-being, we will come up with measures to see how much a host country can retain, and that can be elaborated in the regulations and any other detail that we put out to ensure that the host country at least benefits from these market mechanisms beyond what we clearly see. Section 9, Part 4, now measuring of emissions, reporting and verification. Section 9 is measurement of emissions, and we saying that this section provides for the measurement and calculation of emission reductions and removals of greenhouse gases. And this, as I've been emphasizing from the start, is the only way of establishing whether the measures to respond to climate change are having a desired effect. National reference level. These are reference levels that we have to, that create a baseline beyond which you can use reporting to compare, for example, between now and 2030, how much of that have we contributed to. And this section empowers, for example, the minister to establish, if the reference level is not there, to establish a reference level and targets for reduction of greenhouse gases in the absence of an established reference level. Section 11 is the national reporting. As I said, the Paris Agreement and the Convention requires Uganda to meet several reporting requirements. And here we are looking at the procedure of producing these various national reports, from collecting the information, analyzing, generating reports, and probably archiving. the problem with this national reporting, and that's why I think it's very important to bring the bill, we have the inventory requires us to have a set of information and data which entities, for example, may not be collecting. So if we have this bill, it will be dependent on the private entities. For example, if it's a beverage company, or if it's a soda company, or if it's a cement company, and there is information on industrial production capacity that they are not collecting, that we should, but we require it, then we should be able to access, we should be able to compel them to collect that information, and then they give it to us for purposes of coming up with a very adequate national report, which, as I said, comes from the national inventory. Verification of data, this a bit relates to the one up, is that we need data and information if we are to come up with meaningful measures, but also the reports that we are supposed to submit. Okay. Part 5 is first of all, I have a summary on the slide of part 5, 6 and 7, and then I go into the table format. Part 5 is the institutional arrangements, which provides for the functions and powers of the climate change department in the ministry, the development of the annual report on climate change, establishment of the kind of advisory committee, considering that climate change is cross-cutting, and its corresponding functions, but also how this action trickles down to the district local governments through the district climate department and the climate change committees that exist at the lower local government. Part 6 is about the financial provisions, and this establishes a financial mechanism for enabling Uganda to access both national and international climate finance. I put a question there, but that's something that I alluded to at the start of my talk. Part 7 is the miscellaneous, which provides for issues relating to confidentiality, indemnity from personal liability, litigation on climate change, integration of climate change into the various sectors, and so on. So, Section 13 of the institutional arrangements, Department of Climate Change. This section, if you look at the bill itself, provides for the functions of the department as have been listed in my talk, as the lead government agency for coordinating action on climate change. The bill provides for institutional arrangements, rights from the center to the lower local governments, which again, as I said, is important because while at national level looks so much about policy direction and so on, at the district local government there's lots of implementation of climate action that goes in. This is just something that maybe we may have to be cognizant about as we talk about Department of Climate Change, is that in line with the cabinet position of banning the creation of new government agencies, I think the only realistic way, the way we see it, is to strengthen the Department of Climate Change and give it sufficient power. And I'll come to the slides of how we think sufficient power can be given through this act to allow us undertake our mandate. Section 14 is on the annual reports, and this section provides for the compilation of an annual report on climate change, which shall be submitted to Cabinet and laid before Parliament. If there are issues of, because we suspect we are compelling people to provide information, and we note well that goes hand in hand with non-compliance. So perhaps through these processes of Cabinet and laying before Parliament could compel people beyond the legal provisions that there are to provide this information. I was again brainstorming this, I was looking through these annual reports, and probably we may have to, my personal reflection is changing from the annual report and maybe to a report every after 2 years, so that it either coincides with the biannual transparency reports that I talked about, because then annual may be too soon and too quick for different entities to respond. So that's something which is not here, but we've been reflecting around that, but we remain under your guidance on that. Section 15 is the Policy Committee on Environment, which section provides that Policy Committee on Environment established under the NEMA Act has powers to advise the department and lead agencies on implementation of the national climate change policy. Already this is in practice, because I know and I've attended some of these meetings that when environment issues are being considered, NEMA is the secretariat, and if it's climate change particularly, the department has been the secretariat in this Policy Committee of Environment. Lead agencies, this section provides for lead agencies, as you saw from that diagram I showed you of how we collect information, to have a responsibility not just to collect information and data, but also to implement climate change actions, beyond which then we'll also monitor and come up with reports, because in those reports you're supposed not to show in terms of emission reductions, but also in terms of how much it is that you've done with the corresponding support that you've received in terms of finance, technology, and capacity building. Section 17 is the district department responsible for climate change. This section provides that the natural resources department of the district is designated as the department responsible for climate change. Some of these things are already in practice, because there's been coordination at that level. Section 18 is a district committee responsible for climate change, and this section provides that the district environment and natural resources committee, which is designated as the responsible for climate change matters at the districts. And at the lower local governments, we have, on the advice of the district environment and natural resources committee, appoint a lower local government committee responsible for climate change in their local jurisdiction. Part 6 is the financial provisions, and the section 20 is talking about financing for climate change. So this section provides that both the Honourable Minister responsible for finance and the Honourable Minister responsible for climate change shall provide for climate change financing considerations both at national level, both at national level as well as international climate change financing mechanisms, which is clearly spelled out under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. As I have said, those financing options at least exist, but we know too well that Uganda is not the only beneficiary from the international climate financing, and considering the policies and strategies that we've undertaken and the financing gap that there is, maybe there should be a discussion of how we may have to start looking inward of coming up with mobilizing financing. Initially, at the start of developing of this bill, we had envisaged creating a climate fund, but Minister of Finance was a bit cagey on it, so perhaps Honourable Chair, you may have to interface with the Minister of Finance. But as we went into the final end of producing this bill, I think, at least according to the conversations that we've had informally, they are not as indifferent as they were. I think there's a bit of flexibility, but since it's a financing element, then having a conversation with them makes a bit of sense if you are to address the climate change response. Section 21, incentives for climate change actions. The justification is that this section provides for incentives to persons engaged in implementing measures for adaptation and mitigation. Just to interest, since we talk about climate change being a collective responsibility, how do you interest everybody else and anyone else to do something? Section 22 is about the duties of individuals and private entities. And we're saying this section gives power to the Honourable Minister to impose obligations relating to climate change on individuals and private entities for those that are non-compliant. And this will be done through regulations to be put in place by the Honorable Minister. Section 23 provides for lost. Section 23, even here it doesn't show. Okay. Sorry? Confidentiality. Okay. But the information and data that we provide, because we're going to be getting a lot of data from private entities, individuals, and so on and so forth, that we keep it in that respect. Indemnity from personal liability. So here we're thinking that this section provides that actions done by the Honorable Minister or the Commissioner or the authorized officer shall not attract personal liability, because we do things in national interest. So litigation on climate change, this section provides for the ability of individuals to take court action against government in respect of acts of omissions that are likely to derail efforts to address climate change. And already this is happening, and we've interfaced in those court battles before, but quite often I think we come out victorious. Section 26, reporting by lead agencies. This is under miscellaneous part 7. This section requires lead agencies to submit reports on actions taken to address climate change in their respective sectors to the minister. This again will help us actually in the 2-year report, annual report that we come up with. This actually points to ensuring that all these lead agencies are accountable for their actions, and the minister and the department through this reporting mechanism can identify the gaps and opportunities to respond to climate change. Section 27 is amendment of the Public Finance Management Act. Section 9 of the Public Finance Management Act requires lead agencies to make adequate allocations for climate change measures and actions. And the National Planning Authority, as we all know, has power to issue certificates confirming that the BFP has made adequate provisions. So we think as a way of walking the talk, it could be more like the same, because, for example, in terms of gender, NPA issues certificates in compliance of gender action. So probably this could help us as well if NPA does the same. Section 28 is about regulations, and we're saying this gives powers to the minister to come up with the regulations, which again I think are just necessary because this is just a broad framework law that we try to come up with to implement this act. Section 29 is amendment of Schedule 1. This section provides that the Honourable Minister may, by statutory instrument, amend Schedule 1, which currently provides that the currency point shall be equivalent to 20,000 shillings. For example, if you look at the punitive measures that they are in Section 23.3, provides that a person who contravenes this section is liable on conviction to a fine of not exceeding 1,000 currency points. So 1,000 currency points times the 20,000 equals 20 million. So we are under the guidance of the committee whether we think this is deterrent enough or not, but if it's not, I think we are at liberty to either do it upwards or downwards. Okay, just to finish off, we think the bill is pointing us to coming up with something which is fit for purpose, considering the challenges and opportunities that we've enlisted. Will help us, for example, meet our reporting obligations, strengthen the institutions that's supposed to coordinate, but also focus on the lead agencies to provide information, increase on the level of outreach, research and implementation, resource mobilization, and ultimately implementation and coordination of climate change response in Uganda. So with that, I would like to thank you so much, Honorable Chairman and Honorable Members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, Honorable Chair, for the presentation. Mr. Chairman and Honorable colleagues, we are talking about cushioning ourselves against the internal effects of climate change, which are real with us, and how we go afloat in international dealings. I know that this bill is a bit technical, but I'm happy that you, Chair, you are in the middle of it. I know that when we reach on the floor of Parliament, there will be a lot of time to make members understand and appreciate it. We have presented this as a position as government, ministry. Probably my prayer is that if we can have it, the committee report simplified to the way that members will really understand it and peg it to the bill, it will simplify our way. Because certain things might look out of it. I pray that the technical team, and especially the lawyers, also come on board and make people understand not everybody is a lawyer. The legal implication. The climate change effects are here with us. We are trying to mitigate and adapt the situation. We are trying to play into a bigger picture globally. We are trying to cushion ourselves as a country, protect ourselves as we play into the major international market. So it should be noted that it is for our benefit as a country that we have a door. Protect us from those which might come in to hurt us, but also be able to go out there, protect ourselves, and even advance the interests of the country. So this bill is our bill. I just pray, Mr. Chairman and honorable members of the committee, that we appreciate it and probably help each other, because not many people will take it even on. How we can simplify it and we understand it and know that it's urgent to have such a bill. Mr. Chairman, I was just seated here and I was also remembering one thing. You know, when bills come, then when you don't understand it, you might even resist what you don't know. We had a biotechnology bill in Parliament, and people raised a lot of queries negatively. People didn't want to understand the details of it. And as I was really hearing my team go through this, I was even wondering, can we mitigate the effect of climate change in avoidance of developing technologies? You know, because we are in a evolving world. Technologies are coming on board. I heard, for example, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, my brother lives somewhere abroad, and he was saying, this vaccine of COVID, I don't want it at all. And he said, if there's one developed in Uganda, please try to send us some. But he's a person who's diabetic. He's constant, every day he's injecting himself. Then I asked him, my brother, you're already afraid of developing technologies, but you have been living on a technology. Insulin you are using every day is a technology. How would you avoid one and then accept one? You know? So there's a lot of mixed feelings, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, that we need to help each other. You know? Otherwise, somebody can refuse the bill just because you don't understand it, because you are suspicious, and said, we don't want it. And you know how our colleagues sometimes can act. So it is our duty, Mr. Chairman, I pray that the committee and those who can summarize it in terms which is understandable, and even your neighbors, education, learning is a continuous process. You know, but we need this bill, we needed it actually yesterday, because a lot of things are going to be imparted on us as a country, and we are not prepared. We need really to cushion ourselves, we need to protect ourselves, but also we need to know how to play in the international partner with the international partners. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, and the technical staff and the members. I want to thank you for the presentation. I will start on your last page, the one Bob presented. You made a diagram there, fit for purpose. That gives us the summary of why this bill is important, right? And the first one is reporting obligation, strengthen institution, mobilize climate change finance, outreach issues, implementation and coordination. And when you look at the reporting obligation, you are talking about national, international data collection. Why don't we also say this bill will help us to address climate change in Uganda? Where does that one fall? Yeah, but I'm just putting it maybe, where does it fall under the key themes you have put? Because people want to see that this bill will help us to address climate change in Uganda. Okay. I know other members will come with some clarification comments, and the legal team, I know you have also drafted for us some issues to be raised, clarified on. But let me start with first of all, when you look at the energy policy for Uganda, climate change was mentioned 17 times in that document. When you look at the disaster, when you look at this climate change bill, disaster was mentioned only once. These are just overview observations. And then we shall still need some more information on the carbon market, because according to some other stakeholders, they are saying carbon market was not fully addressed in this bill, and yet that is one key area. If we can develop that market, it will help to address climate change. Developed countries are polluting their environment, and they want us to create things for them in Africa. How much money are they going to pay us? Of course, that will come in the negotiations as we meet them and we negotiate with them. But how much money will they pay? Are they only paying for tree planting? How about our trees in the national parks that are also absorbing carbon dioxide? Can they also pay for them? So the issue of carbon markets, we really need to look at it seriously. And then can we insert new clauses? I think our legal person will help us, because there are suggestions for new clauses. Is it possible to put some new clauses or parts? Yesterday, I think you noted them. And then there was then issue to do with litigation. You remember the comment from Minister of Energy about litigation? Our legal person, we shall require you to bring those out. Then there was the issues of that we have mentioned only 3 conventions or protocols. What happens when we shall have subsequent protocols? Will they still fit in the bill, or they will make the bill irrelevant? And then on the action plans, developed by districts, Karuma Dam is shared by 3 districts, I think Nwaya, Kriadongo and another one. So who will develop action plan for for Karuma Power Station? So maybe we need, do we do district plans? How will they fit Karuma or Bujagali or Isimba in their district plan? Will they have all the capacity to really give us a very detailed plan? So those are issues. How about cities? We have talked only of KCCA. How about other emerging cities? So these are some of the issues we need to look at in the bill. And then the Article 6 countries to help the developed country, the developing country like Netherlands. Yeah, maybe they can do some pilot projects which you can help us from their experience, we can copy. I think that one we don't have much And then there are things you are doing together with Ministry of Energy already. There are some of the projects or programs. I don't know, Clark. Yesterday there was an issue where Ministry of Energy was saying they're already doing something with Ministry of Water and Environment along that line. I don't know which projects. Then there was issue to do with the power of the minister, our legal person. There was issue mentioned yesterday on the power of the minister. We need a comment there. And then the policy committee on environment is chaired by the Prime Minister, yes, but we don't know how frequent they meet, because the biggest problem we have is coordination. Like I gave an example. If you go to Ministry of Water and Environment, you will get they are doing some irrigation. If you go to Ministry of Agriculture, there is some irrigation. If you go to Ministry of Energy, they are doing some nursery beds, and yet NFA is also doing nursery beds. So they are scattered efforts, and we thought maybe Ministry of Policy Committee on Environment would help to address some of these issues. So we are doing some work in the various MDAs, but they are scattered. We cannot even report properly on them. And in this regard, there are other protocols which we are not maybe following keenly, like you talked about Vienna Convention, the Basel. How about those ones? Who is capturing information about them? So there are these. How can we coordinate climate change issues in the country when we are scattered like this? And so, and the OPM is running the Sendai Protocol, is hosting the Sendai Protocol on disasters, and yet climate change is causing a lot of disasters, like floods and so on. Then there is issue of mining and floods, which even came on the floor of Parliament 2 or 3 days ago in Bulambuli and those Mount Elgon area. So now, efforts are really scattered. How can we put them together? Then there are other dams that are built under CDM, like Isimba, like Nyagak. Who is capturing information, and are they really briefing Ministry of Water or Climate Change Department? So those are real issues. And then Climate Change Fund is being, the Minister of Finance, they don't want to create Climate Change Fund. They don't want to create more funds, because they say we have created Youth Fund, Women Fund, what other funds? There are so many funds there. So they don't want new funds. But there is Tree Fund. So can we change the name of Tree Fund to become Climate Change Fund? After all, tree planting is to address climate change. So these are things we need to address. There is already fund. Why don't we just change the name? Okay. So these are just my observation. I know Legal Council has a lot of issues. Members have a lot of issues. They will have to raise so that we can address these things together. Thank you very much. So who is honorable? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. You have almost highlighted everything. Just a few observations I have. In our last workshop that we had some time to go through this bill. I want to invite you to section 24. You didn't number the slides, the pages also. You said section 24, indemnity from personal liability. The rationale for this section is that acts done in unofficial capacity should not attract personal liability on the part of the officers involved. I remember when we were in a workshop, Chair, we discussed and said we need professionals, certified people, in that they are responsible for their actions, sometimes to avoid bias. There are buildings that we have seen being constructed in wetlands and other places, and when somebody has invested a lot of money, the ministry comes from nowhere, people come from all angles and say, no, as if they were not there. And they are the ones who issued the certifying documents, all the approval. So people should be responsible. This indemnity, we discussed it in detail, Chair, if you remember very well. We need to come clear on this position. We said we need certified people. We have professionals. You are there. We have people like our chairperson who are qualified in this. We need surveyors who can train them. We don't need people who will act based on bias. We have politics playing everywhere. So on such indemnity, some people have been abusing it. We need to come clear on that. Second chair is on section 13. Section 13, Department of Climate Change, where we said that in line with the cabinet position banning the creation of new government agencies, the authorities, the only realistic way forward is to strengthen the Department of Climate Change and give it sufficient power and authority to discharge its mandate. This is very correct, but it remains vague as in here. We discussed, we were together with you, we discussed and said, we came up with a title. Did we say commissioner or somebody to head? We agreed that the department can stay, but somebody with more authority heads the department. So you remember some title we came up with?
Like
somebody who has the mandate.
We also talked about how about the possibility of creating a climate change council.
Only that the authorities, cabinet is moving away from that direction. That's how we end up there. We need to come clear in that the document remains very, very clear. Somebody with authority. We are giving a lot of powers here and a lot of finances are involved. The other observation, Chair, is on part 6, financial provisions. Establishes a financial mechanism for enabling Uganda to access both national and international climate finance. Hey, again you're asking, how is this achieved?
No, that was for me.
Okay. Okay, I also leave it to the committee. I was also thinking the same way.
For your mind.
Okay, because you said 3.5 billion US dollars. That, I submit here. Thank you.
Now, can we get some comments from our dear colleagues there?
Thank you, Chair. There are not so many, but we are having a problem with the fact that the price update as of 2020. So should we, I don't know.
That one is already explained.
Yes.
That one.
So we are going to remove the domestication of the cattle protocol.
No, according to Bob, you don't need to remove it. You don't need to remove it because there's still an obligation on the part. You want me to remove it?
We don't need to remove it.
Okay, the legal counsel was whispering something, but I think he's saying the same thing Honorable Songa is saying, that I emphasize the importance of the KP. First of all, the Kyoto Protocol was the only binding document at that time, which has two broad objectives, as I said. The first objective is to make sure developed countries reduce emissions based on the 1990 levels to about 5%, which they have done among themselves. But where the contrast is that for them they think they have done it and the likes of China are increasing. But the second objective is for these same countries to support developing nations to reduce emissions. So the question then becomes, to what extent has that been done? It has not been done. So whilst they could have achieved their point 1, point 2 is not yet achieved, and for us, we still hold on to that to ensure that for us to be able to address these challenges, there is a particular objective that has not been met and will require finance, capacity building and technology for us to work it up.
And another thing you needed to explain,
yes, sir,
for the benefit of the members and our legal counsel, is who are the Annex 1 counties and who are the non-Annex 1 counties, because that's the only difference between the protocol and Paris Agreement.
Okay.
Paris Agreement did not come clearly on that one.
Okay. How did this breaking down of countries come about? During the Industrial Revolution, what they call the Annex 1 countries are the ones that are tasked to having the responsibility. I remember talking about historical responsibility. So the countries that led to the increase of emissions in the atmosphere that led to the distortion of the climate system dates as far back as the Industrial Revolution. So now those were clustered as Annex 1 or developed, because it's from that revolution that they got the benefits of development. So we cannot be tagged into that if you're talking about justice and fairness and equity, being a lawyer, to say that also Uganda is going to be tagged into that same group of people. So you can see how fair the convention and the Kyoto Protocol were. And that's why even look at the Paris Agreement, you say that to implement this Paris Agreement, we are doing it in the spirit, or it enhances the implementation of the UNFCCC. That is the spirit within which we work in this climate regime. So Annex 1 are the developed first countries that have the historical responsibility of pumping out these emissions in the atmosphere. The non-Annex 1 is us, who have never had a responsibility and probably may never contribute to that large-scale emissions in the atmosphere to lead to this distortion of the climate system.
The legal wanted to say something.
Yes, Chair, I just wanted to add something small on the importance of the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah. We all know that a number of projects were implemented under the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM projects. The CDM stands for Clean Development Mechanism, the biggest of which is the Mujagari Energy Project. It's a CDM project. So, and there are so many other CDM projects in this country. So, in the spirit of protecting those investments that are already done under the Kyoto Protocol, I think it is important that we keep the Kyoto Protocol as part of the deal, because these projects are continuing. And right now we are in the process of transitioning from the CDM to the new market mechanisms. Now, the new market mechanisms are not yet clear, but it is a transition process. So I think it is important to keep the Kyoto Protocol as part of the deal. And I think the Paris Agreement does not state anywhere that it is replacing the Kyoto Protocol. It's not stated anywhere like that. So the protocol is still there, and is important for the country.
Okay.
Yes,
Another issue.
And the other issue was from the other stakeholders is the fact that on the clause 27, clause 25, which allows any person to seek relief from the High Court against governments, individuals or private entities whose actions or omissions threaten or likely to threaten efforts towards adaptation and mitigation of climate change. And that's subclause 3, it says that it allows that the application to the High Court to be considered whether the person can or cannot prove the threats or the likely threats. And the stakeholders are especially from energy, these developing sectors which might have an impact on climate change. That it's a bit of going to stall, and it's stalling their efforts and also like discouraging the sector players in development of that sector.
Yes. Can I respond?
Yes.
Let's just clarify. First of all, this provision, this clause, closely resembles the one that we have in the National Environment Act. So it's not a new thing. And the intention behind it is to create an accountability regime, so that people are accountable for their actions. And it's not only against government, it's also against private individuals or private entities. So if the requirement industries is behaving in a manner that is inconsistent with the national climate change policy, the objective is set to reduce emissions, a private citizen can take an initiative and bring that private sector player to account. So it is intended to create that accountability regime, so that people know that, oh, there is a law, by the way, if you behave in a manner that is jeopardizing the country's goals on climate change, you can be brought to account. And the last section, which talks about that you don't have to prove personal injury or harm. Again, that's a concept developed under the various environmental law frameworks, enabling a private citizen to take action. Because we recognize that in most cases, these harms cause widespread damage, cause damage to the wider public. So the intention here is to make sure that an individual can act in public interest and bring up something which is in the public interest, bring a case that is in the public interest that protects the general good of the public. So it is a good intention. So if it is for good intention. So if the responsible parties have not behaved in a manner that attracts liability, there is nothing to worry about. If you've done something that is consistent with the country's goals on climate change, then there shouldn't be anything to worry about. The only problem comes when you are falling short of promoting the interests of the country, the goals of the country on climate change.
Bob, we wanted to know your thoughts on your department in your presentation is mandated to integrate, see efforts of integration of climate change in the whole workings of government. And the stakeholders and members were concerned that in the bill, there is no effort in that they wanted, if there could be, should we include a clause where we mandate the National Curriculum Development Center coordinating with your department to have climate change integrated into the education curriculum in all levels of learning.
Okay, thank you, Legal Counsel. This will go hand in hand with the question the Honorable asked about the authority of the department. First of all, how does authority of the department come about? If this bill goes through as is, I think it's going to increase the authority of the department. In how is it going to do it? Precedent has been set before. If you look at the Water Act, for example, it gives the director or the commissioner power to write to various agencies to provide whatever information that they have or to issue water permits. So in the same spirit, even if it's a director of climate change or commissioner through this bill is given that power, then it becomes much more easy. Now that's on one part. On the other part, we have said that there's been already a bit of workings between certain government agencies. But what is lacking is strengthening this with a legal backing. And it happens. NEMA does it. I've given an example of the Directorate of Water Development. It should be just to strengthen that provision within this legislation